some good news, of course, in the regions. Victoria lockdown has ended there. Questions remain, though, as to whether a whole state still needs to be locked down. Joining me live now is Liberal Senator James Paterson. Thanks for your time. What did you make of the initial decision to put the whole state, no exemptions, into lockdown?
Well, I should say at the start, Tom, I do welcome the Victorian Government's decision today to release regional Victoria from lockdown. It's very clear that there are no cases in regional Victoria and therefore it is a safe thing to do and that's appropriate. And going back historically, looking at the decision to put all of Victoria in lockdown, that's a very cautious decision to make. And I appreciate we are dealing with the Delta variant and it is more infectious. It does transmit more quickly than last year. But I would say if we're going to have an evidence-led, an evidence-based response, that we should lock down areas that have a demonstrated need to lock down, not just a possibility that they might need to be locked down.
So it was too cautious, in other words?
Well, it was very cautious, and I do understand why state governments want to be cautious, and so I'm not being too critical of them, but I would ask that they really carefully consider the evidence base when they make decisions like that, because it has a profound effect on people's lives. And some of these regional communities have been locked down without ever having had a case in the entire pandemic since the beginning. And I mean, that is really a disproportionate burden.
Right, and when they're far away, I mean, you know, you can be very conservative and say, well, there's a slight trace in sewage in some area and you can go, right, totally cautious. But when you don't even have that, you're saying don't lock down again in the future. That's your wish?
I just think it should be evidence-led. If the evidence shows that there is a likelihood of cases, then obviously lockdowns are regrettably still necessary. But if there's no evidence for it, then I think we should be thinking really carefully about what the impact of that is.
We're seeing Victoria now call on younger people to get AstraZeneca and open that up to them. Do you welcome that?
Yeah, this is another really good initiative. I absolutely welcome this from the Victorian Government yesterday. It allows, with informed consent, people aged between 18 and 59 to come forward and get AstraZeneca, including at the state-based hubs, not just at their GPs as previously. That's a great thing. If you think it's in your interest, if you've considered the evidence and you're willing to make your informed consent, I absolutely encourage young Victorians to come forward.
The ATAGI advice from where we sit now, is that quite damaging and in some ways unnecessary?
I certainly don't think it was ATAGI's intention, and I have pursued this with them through the COVID committee, the COVID Senate committee. It was, again, an extremely cautious piece of advice, and it was based on the premise of no community transmission in Australia. And unfortunately, the risk of making a determination like that is that while we didn't have any community transmission at the time, very quickly soon after we did, and some time was lost. So, well, you can't catch up. That's right. I mean, even with an 8-week interval, as we now have in New South Wales for AstraZeneca, that's still a long time before you get full protection.
Is it the best body, considering it doesn't take into account, as you said, it didn't seemingly take into account a likelihood or enough likelihood of future lockdowns, but it also doesn't take into account the other effects of lockdowns on the economy, mental health? Is it the right body to make what was, in the end, the ultimate call on the use of AstraZeneca?
I would encourage ATAGI to take the broadest view of its remit and to consider the broadest possible impacts of its decisions. It's probably not appropriate for ATAGI to be doing economic modelling and considering those sorts of things, but they should be thinking about the possibility that outbreaks will occur and that they will spread quickly,
I think they
and
have
therefore
said
what
that
the consequences
they
would
do
be.
broadly take into account a possibility of an outbreak. But were they not thinking it was likely enough?
Well, clearly in this instance, they didn't give sufficient weight to that, given that they have reversed their own decision for New South Wales and other areas that have outbreaks.
And when they give that decision, should the government be more willing to say, thanks for that, here are some other aspects, including all the economic effects, mental health, other, even surgery, elective surgery, and say, on balance, we're not ignoring your advice, but we're going to ameliorate it, or whatever it might be. Should the government be more willing to do that?
Look, I think governments always should robustly test the advice that they get and against other expert advice we receive, consider what the right decision is. Having said that, well, I don't know. I wasn't there in the room, Tom, so I'm not sure when the advice was conveyed. But having said that, can you imagine what would happen if in Australia our expert group on technical vaccine administration gave us advice that we shouldn't be administering it to these people and the government ignored that? That would have real ramifications for vaccine hesitancy, I fear.
Perhaps it needs to be set up differently, though.
What I'm saying is I think it is reasonable for government to accept the expert advice when it is clear and unequivocal, as it appears to have been in this case. I think post this pandemic, once we're out of this, we do have to look at broader reforms and make sure that we are really well tooled up for any future pandemics, to make sure that really risk-based advice is given, that really carefully weighted advice considering all the consequences of it.
We're still in this for a long time. Why not do that now? Why wait till the end?
Well, we're mid-stride, Tom, and I think a change of direction might be a little bit of a difficult thing to execute, and it is pleasing that ATAGI is taking a broader view now that we do have some outbreaks in Australia.
Would it be good to have a Royal Commission so we know once and for all what happened with Pfizer doses, when they might have been available, the negotiation process and so on? Again, even if it's not mid-stride.
Oh, look, I think it's a bit premature to start thinking about how do we quarterback how the crisis went when we're still in the middle of resolving the crisis. Self-evidently, I think there will be inquiries and reviews at the end of this when we're on the other side to learn about what went well and what didn't. The exact status of that inquiry, I don't have a strong view on at this point, but I'm sure, of course, the government will review the whole pandemic and the response to the pandemic, because unfortunately there might be future pandemics and we'll have to prepare for those.
Vaccine advice as well, just in terms of businesses and how they'll approach this, either for their workers or for their customers. Are you comfortable with a mandatory approach there?
I think some businesses are getting a little bit ahead of themselves because all Australians are not yet eligible for the vaccine and haven't had an opportunity to have a vaccine.
But once they are, I'm talking.
But that's why I'm saying it's a little bit premature. This is a conversation to have once every Australian's had the opportunity to be vaccinated, and there may be still some that choose not to be vaccinated, and then we can start contemplating this.
But don't we need to have the conversation now, because people weighing up whether they want a vaccine need to be told now what the consequences will be?
I think there's plenty of time for those things to happen. At the moment, we're ramping up the supply and the vaccine rollout is accelerating, and Australians are still coming forward without any pressure or any exertion. I think that's a really good thing, and I want to maintain that for as long as possible. I don't want to be in a situation...
You don't want to start a conversation where you're talking about mandatory because you think it's the wrong conversation?
I think it could have an unintended consequence of discouraging people who are voluntarily coming forward now who are very happy to be vaccinated.
Okay, but where do you sit in a broad sense on that mandatory element? Are you comfortable with that?
Well, the government has said that we won't change the law to make it mandatory for people to be vaccinated, and I think that's appropriate. The exceptions to that are in high-risk settings like aged care and hospitals, where it has historically been required to have a flu vaccine.
So what does that mean, not change the law? What do you understand the law to be right now?
What I understand the law to be now is that businesses, based on their own risk profile, can consider whether they want to make it mandatory, and it has to relate to the need of the business. And so sub-businesses, obviously in the healthcare and aged care space, have a greater need to consider a mandatory vaccination than other businesses.
So you'd leave it up to whatever courts decide, essentially?
Well, I think that the status of the law is relatively clear as it is, and the government doesn't believe that there needs to be any amendments to the law as it is.
All right. Well, perhaps we'll see down the track when there are some more examples. James Paterson, thank you.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Tom.